Welcome to another episode, another podcast of Straight Talking Property. And we've got myself, Ashley Banfield from Wealth and Success Academy, along with Emmanuel Ezekiel. We've got Jimmy London, Brett Alegre Wood, still residing in Singapore. And we've got let's call him our resident planning consultant expert, David Kemp. So welcome, everyone. Say a quick hello.
Hi, everyone.
How are you doing, guys?
Good. Okay, so today we've got David back on again. Thank you, mate. I know your time is taken up a lot these days, especially with the new permitted development rights, and this is what we want to talk about today. So before we get into it, basically what we want to help people with is when the government says you can now build up, you can do this, you can turn shops and empty buildings into residential and that type of stuff. And I'm guessing a lot of new people will be out there, and there will also be a lot of people who don't understand this, who will try and, let's not be flippant, but try and build a so-called property course on the back of it, but don't really understand it and never intend to use it themselves. So we want to make sure that people do the right thing, get the right advice from an expert such as yourself, people like us who are, leaning heavily on experts like you to fully understand the permitted development rights changes. So firstly, I guess, quickly, if you can just, for the real beginners, just do a quick 1 minute outline of what permitted development rights are and whether it means that, some people think that, I can put 7 meters on my house, total height of 30 meters without even going to the council, and I don't need to get any planning permission because it's permitted development.
Okay, so
just before David starts, his background was a lawyer, right? So asking him for a simple explanation may not happen. What I would like to say, David,
that's very kind of you.
What I would like to say is, think about this as the idiot's guide to PD for the beginners, because that's where a lot of people are going to be. So in terms of where the quick wins might be, and to keep it what I call as simple as possible for idiots like me that really need to understand things very simply and succinctly.
But also it's for experts out there who think they know.
Yes, experts.
Carry on, mate. David.
Very simply, what I would say is that if you don't want to go through the full planning application process and you want a sort of a shortcut to getting planning permission that strips out some of the conditions, some of the requirements, and is a quicker way to do that, then permitted development rights are quite useful because you then don't have to go through the full planning application process. It can make it quicker, it can make it cheaper to get planning permission, but it's a legal process in many ways because it's got a number of criteria, a number of boxes that you have to tick, and you have to check those boxes off as you go along. And some of those boxes are quite straightforward in terms of you can only be so many meters up, or so many meters far away from your neighbour. So some of those conditions might be quite black and white. Some of those conditions are a little bit more grey. So they might be subject to things like enough parking, no flood risk, no impact on the neighbours in terms of their outlook or sunlight or daylight and things like that. So some of those things are a little bit more nebulous, a little bit more vague. And what we have within the permitted development rights that have come forward we have a mixture of some of these conditions. So it's not completely straightforward. It's not where you could look at it and say to yourself, I will definitely be able to get permission and build this out. What we can do is we can certainly we can look at these and say, well, I know that this building, I might be able to do that, but I'm going to have to look into it in a little bit more detail. So, it's a brief overview. That's what permitted development rights do. They help to cut through the process potentially a little bit quicker and a little bit cheaper.
But there still is a process.
Yeah, there's definitely a process, and you have to have a planning consultant and knowing the laws, which have now been changed quite dramatically. But in terms of what I call the beginner or the novice developer, which kind of properties for them are going to be the easiest to look at that might have the ability to have the relaxed laws of PD where they might get a quick win, they can get in and out relatively quickly? So what kind of property should they be looking for specifically, whether it be detached, terraced, flat, what kind of, or commercial, which ones are going to have the easiest ability to make some sort of change? So we're not talking about big schemes, people that might have between 50 and 300,000 to play with in terms of an overall development scheme. What sort of properties do you think might suit the new PD schemes and the relaxation of the laws?
Well, I still think that there are going to be chances with PD with shops, particularly retail shops, and they fall into kind of two categories. So those that kind of are more of in a high street location, they're going to be still worth looking at because there's been changes around the law which mean that there's more flexibility in terms of other commercial uses that you can go to. With some of those, because, for instance, they might be in prime retail locations, it might still be difficult to get fully residential conversion under permitted development rights to those units. You might be able to do some stuff at the back if you can tick some of the other boxes under permitted development. Generally speaking, with the shops, though, if you want to go to residential, it's better off looking at more peripheral pitches around the high street, slightly secondary pitches, particularly if you're on a corner, because then you can get sunlight and daylight from the side, you can get better quality units. And better quality tends to mean, A, it's easy to get it through the process with all those grey areas in the boxes you have to tick. And also, they're more attractive to buyers, and therefore they'll have more value to them as well. But there are a number of other things around things that are worth looking at. So offices, I still think office to resi PD is worth looking at as well. There are now new requirements in terms of a lot of these PDs that you have to have good quality light, you have adequate natural light coming in to all habitable rooms. So if you're going to go up into roof space, for instance, where there's no roof lights at the moment, you won't be able to do that under most of these permitted developments. Going to be a bit more difficult, but I still think office to resi is still worth looking at. The third area I would say is blocks of flats or terraces where there's uneven height. So you've either got a detached purpose-built block of flats, freestanding, standing on its own, no other buildings nearby, and you might be able to build on top of that and get 2 extra stories there. The fourth one is therefore it's going to be terraces or detached or mixed use blocks of flats and shops, and you can get PD on those as well. I'll come on to these ones in a moment. Mm-hmm. And the fifth one is buildings which are in an office use or they're flats and they've been vacant for at least 6 months. And you might be able to get permission to knock that down and build up to 2 stories on top of that building. So basically rebuild to the same height then plus 2 stories on the same footprint. And you also put in basements and cellars and lower ground stuff as well. And lastly,
a maximum of 30 metres in height, right? Once the building has been extended up.
That's right. Yeah. I'll come on to the conditions and the requirements in a moment, but that's we're actually on the redevelopment of commercial buildings. The last one, if you're knocking down and rebuilding, is actually a maximum of 18 metres, not 30 metres. If you're not knocking down a purpose-built block of flats, but you're just putting 2 new stories on top, you go up to 30 metres with the new 2 floors.
Okay.
You notice the difference. It's a tighter restriction if you're doing a rebuilding PD.
Yeah. Yeah.
The last one is there's been changes to the use classes order, and it's made it more easy to go to some other commercial use classes. So, for instance, at the moment, something like a day nursery or a medical practice is in the same use class as village halls and that sort of stuff. And so in policy terms, councils don't want you to move out of those sorts of community uses. They're generally protected in policy terms.
Yeah.
But after September, some of those uses, they're going to be separated out. So those uses, like let's say village halls, they're going to go into a more protected category.
Yep.
Then the clinics, the day nurseries, they're going to go into a general commercial use class category, which means that then you'd be able to convert it by without needing planning permission to say like a Tesco Express or a shop. And then if you convert it to that and you take it into that use, then you've got more freedom to redevelop your site as well. So there are things around that. I've got an actual example that we're working on at the moment where we can't get rid of a community hall on a site the client wants to redevelop. So what they're going to do is they're going to change it to a creche or day nursery or to medical facility before September, which they can do under the current use class. Then it's sitting in a day nursery use, let's say, for example, in a day nursery. Come the 1st of September, that day nursery no longer sits in the same use class as a community hall. It now sits in the same use class as a Tesco's Express, for instance. Yep. So then they'll be able to get around the policy saying you can't lose a community use from this site because they'll just simply swap it over to a Tesco Express. So that's kind of just playing with the use classes order at that point in time. And because it's the use classes order, the council can't bring in an Article 4 direction to restrict that movement. They can do it if it sits in a permitted development order, but they can't do it if it's in a use classes order. So they get around it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, well.
So when you say purpose built, some
We lost Ashley, did we?
Ashley, we just lost you.
Yeah.
That's all right. He hasn't got permitted development rights at the moment, so
He looked like he was in his shed.
he's gone to committee and it hasn't gone forward, so he's having to reapply.
He was going to ask me to clarify purpose built, what I meant by purpose built. So when I'm talking about purpose built, I'm talking about, in this case, it's blocks of flats which were built initially as flats. So they're not converted by permitted development to flats. They're not converted by a full application for planning permission to flats either. So they have to have been erected as flats in the first place. And they need to have been completely erected as flats and ready for use within certain dates in order to take advantage of permitted development rights. And in the case of these permitted development rights, between the 1st of July 1948 and the 5th of March 2018. So that's the 1st of July.
Significance on the 1948 date? Is that just plucked out of the air?
Yeah.
Or is there something happened there?
I was going to say that the significance of those dates is July 1948 is when the first Town and Country Planning Act came into force. So it's basically the start of the modern day Town and Country Planning system in the UK. And the 5th of March 2018 is when the Minister for Housing and Local Government and Planning first announced the PD right to Parliament. So from that point of view, that's when it kicks off.
Yeah, good.
So, David, in terms of these purpose-built flats, for instance, obviously you've got two kinds of flats. In fact, three, if I go through it. So the first is you've got flats with flat roofs, which is going to be easier. You then have flats with pitch roofs.
Yeah.
And then you have flats that are owned by a freeholder and he rents them out. And then you've got flats that have already been sold or partly sold. So you've got a mixture between renters and leaseholders. how much more difficult is it to get that in regards to if it's not owned as one freehold, but you've got lots of different leaseholders in terms of getting the planning permission, the consent, and the build?
That's a cracking question. Let me just break it down in terms of, first of all, what the conditions and the requirements in terms of the pure black letter of those requirements state. So, as far as that's concerned, whether or not the occupants are leasing or they own is irrelevant. It's not a requirement. Right. So it doesn't stop you in principle from qualifying for a PD to be able to get it. So let's put that aside for 1 second. So that means that our principal distinction is between a flat roof and something with a pitched roof on it. Yep. If it's got a pitched roof on it, obviously if it's 2 full stories and then it's got like a mansard on top, I wouldn't count that as a 3-story development. Unless, of course, there's already units in the 3-story in terms of the mansard, and you've got dormer windows or something like that around that. It's just by way of an example, because I happen to have been looking at one this week. I don't think the council's going to say, unless there's accommodation in that roof space already, I don't think they're going to say it's 3 stories. They're going to say it's 2 stories plus a roof. And therefore, it doesn't meet that criteria of being a minimum of 3 stories. If it's above that, and it's a minimum of 3 stories, then the other main issue you're going to be hard up against is the test of external appearance under this PD right. Now, we don't know what necessarily that means, but the council have the right to look at the proposal for the extra stories and say they either accept the impact on the external appearance of the building, or it's not, or they don't like the impact on the external appearance of the building. So this is all going to be a grey area in terms of what you do, whether or not you take that roof off, you slot in another story or another 2 stories, and you basically crank the whole thing up another 1 or 2 stories, but keep the pitched roof, which you may have to do. Because if you take off the pitched roof and then you kind of convert it to a flat roof, the council might not be so happy about that. Yeah. So they'll have to weigh all that up. So there's that issue in terms of how it looks. Now, coming on to your last point about whether or not it's let out or occupied, where that becomes more of an issue is where, for instance, you've got traffic and parking and highways issues to work out in relation to the flats. Yep. Now, one thing, practically speaking, you're going to have to work out, and I would do this before you even start applying for PD, is do we have enough parking spaces without having to go and ask anybody who lives there for permission to move their parking space around? Because once you start having to get into the leases, or you have to go to individual owners and ask them to move their parking spaces around, rejig parking spaces, etc., you might find some resistance. There might be like a tenant management association or something, or like a residence management organisation that has a constitution that says we've all got to vote in favour of it in order for the parking spaces to be moved, etc. And one of my partners, JV partners that I work with, we've been looking at this. We was looking at it from last year, actually, when we knew what these requirements would be. And we've already dropped one of our sites from our list to do this on, because it's just going to be too much of a headache to try and renegotiate all this. You're going to be in for like tens of thousands of pounds of legal fees, and probably a flat no from the tenants. You always got, you've probably got maybe 15, 20 tenants in most of these blocks. And you're always going to get 1 or 2 who say, no, we don't want to move our parking spaces around, etc. And they're going to resist. And so you spend all that money getting nowhere before you can even put the PD in.
So, David, can I ask you a question? Because we've had something similar on one of our schemes where the parking to spaces ratio needed to be a certain way. So the only way that we could provide it, including a transport link report and a car club, is we had to put a stacking unit into the scheme. So do you think that putting a stacking unit into a scheme like they do in America these days now, whether you got restricted in terms of parking, to give you the sufficient parking space. And that also goes in line with council not wanting you to have cars and putting in cycle stalls. So you've got this disparity between the two, trying to get this balance between parking, non-parking, car club, and various things. So everything that you're saying just leads to you really have to have a planning consultant to advise you, because it really is a minefield, and you just don't know what mine you're going to step on and blow yourself up if you don't have the right advice. And, you know, even though you've got all of this, in theory, great PD rights, it's not quite as great as people think it's going to be. And that's why you need, in my opinion, you need someone like yourself always to advise you and help you and guide you through this process.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's a plug for you, by the way.
Yeah. I'm grateful. I would say that, and a good parking and highways consultant. We pretty much go to the parking and highways consultant straight away and ask them. We first of all tell them whether or not we've got any spare spaces, whether or not we can get the ratio down without messing with any other people's spaces. Then we'll look at cycle parking. We might look at car stacking. The thing is with car stacking is then throw us up against other tests in the PD, like external appearance, what that's going to look like, etc. Because then you're kind of rushing from frying pan out into the fire in some of these tests. And also, is it in an area where you've got reasonably good public transport anyway, so you can push the ratios down anyway. And so, having a good parking highways consultant can literally gain you units in a scheme, or put PD on the table, whereas it may not have been on the table beforehand. Client, planning consultant, and a highways consultant at the start, and then you start getting into design and building around that and how it's going to look. But then it's not, when you start getting into design, it's not a question of if or whether I can get PD. It's a question of how I get PD and what it's going to look like. And if you're asking that question, then you're in a good position.
It's interesting because we've had the other side where we've actually looked at PD schemes that have been approved and the plans are all there. And when you look at it, you look at the livable area and how they've had to make it, and like kitchens with poles in the middle of them. And, to get the milk out and open the door to the fridge, you've basically got to step, and reach over. It's like things like that. And I think that's where, it's all good to get the planning, but you've actually almost got to remember the next thing, which is make the space livable. Otherwise the sales are affected, But yeah,
I agree. Some of it's crackers, absolutely. I mean, I think the government's trying to address this. There was a report into all this at the beginning of the year by I can't remember what it's got a lot of B's in it. It's the Building a Better and More Beautiful Homes in Britain report. It's like a government quango, and they reported in January. It's a big report. I actually looked through it. It was an interesting one because they recommended various changes to PD. So you didn't have rabbit hutches and you didn't have poor sunlight and daylight. And I think some of those recommendations kind of began to filter down. They've also recommended things like local design codes and stuff like that for developers, but that we haven't seen those into the PD. But obviously the government's followed up on that and thought, well, actually, we need to be asking developers when they submit their PD schemes for office to resi or anything like that, that instead of just submitting bland floor plans which show no layout, we want to see what the layout is. We want to see how many bedrooms, what the furniture layout is, and so on and so forth, and you've got decent quality space, and there are no windowless habitable rooms there as well. So, I mean, there is a way of getting PD still on those schemes where you don't have windows, and it's something that I've already had an opinion from a QC on, so I know that we can do it. And it's just one of those things where I know that there's going to be battles down the line with this. Developers are always going to try and be pushing the boundaries of what they can do under PD. There's a little game that goes on in these sorts of situations. There's cat and mouse. The council really doesn't want to give up its opportunity to fiddle with the design of a scheme. And when you're trying to go in as a developer and you're trying to get the best out of it and optimize it as best as possible, the council starts asking, well, we're not sure you can do that. I'm not sure you can do that. So we've anticipated some of those battles down the line, and I've got an opinion or two ready from QCs, which I can throw under planning officer's nose and say, well, actually, we've already thought about that. Can we have our PD, please? It usually works, actually, because they don't know whether or not you're going to be that well prepared. So, you just know these things are coming. I mean, it's a great opportunity for the planning appeal system and the courts and lawyers. We usually always do well out of it at the end of it.
I'm going to throw a couple of other questions.
Sorry, Manuel, just going to jump in there. I don't know whether you guys have seen the power has totally gone in Ashley's building. The builders have cut him off, so he won't be jumping back on. I don't know whether you saw the notification.
It's all right. We haven't been missing him, mate, so it's fine.
It's so good. All right, I'll crack on. I'll mute myself.
So,
who's Ashley, by the way?
So a couple of questions. Obviously, in the new PDs, they've excluded certain kind of properties or businesses, and one of them is pubs. And the reason why I want to bring up the question is that you often get agents touting pubs in terms of being able to, change use into residential. And even with the new relaxations of PD, they certainly haven't covered pubs. So even pubs that were struggling before COVID, now with restrictions, they're probably not going to be open. What would you say to people looking at pubs in regards to how long it still might take them to get any kind of change of use, if any, on it?
Very good question. I don't actually think it's going to make an awful lot of difference. What's happened with pubs is they've moved from one of the A use classes into sui generis. And basically what that means is any movement from any sui generis use, it's almost if you're in a sui generis use, you're in a little bubble. So moving in or out of that bubble always requires an application for planning permission. So as far as the process is concerned on that, that's not really changed because you didn't really have very much PD to go in and out of pubs in the first place. Unless, of course, you could sort of say, well, it's not a pub, it's more of a restaurant. And so you kind of get that very fine distinction with gastro pubs and stuff. Are they a pub? Is it a restaurant? So that's where first question you have to ask is, am I dealing with a pub in the first place? Because there is actually there was no specific classification for pubs. But now pubs, if they're alcohol-related uses, most of their business is selling alcohol, and food is pretty much like a support service around that. They'll fall into the sui generis category. Now, it's become more and more difficult to get change of use from pubs in any event. Partly because the councils, for their own policies, have always been treating them as sort of like a community use anyway.
Yeah.
Where it's been easier is where you can show that a pub has been vacant for months and months and months on end. It's got a history of falling sales, and it's pretty much dead in the water as a business. And despite the fact that with the best will in the world, you couldn't probably find a way to get it back on its feet, then it's worth looking at. So as far as what I would say is that even though it's been taken out of one of the use classes and put effectively into another use class, in policy terms, I don't think it really changes a lot. So, Emmanuel, if you're looking at a pub at the moment, and let's say that pub after September has been vacant and empty for 6 to 12 months, and with the best one in the world, you can't get a change in its circumstances. It's still going to suffer as a pub. Then, unfortunately, then I think you've still got a case to go forward with an application for planning permission. And I think that it leads on to a broader point, and that is that when you're looking at these permitted development rights, it's not a case of if I'm in the PD, I can build my extra stories or I can put this replacement building on this site. But if I'm not in the PD, I can't. It doesn't work like that. It means that you've got a quicker way of getting to where you want to be. But if you're not in the PD, you might then only have to apply for planning permission, full planning permission, but you might still get it. But I mean, you look at some of these things, And a lot of these, and we've seen the posts also in the forums as well, Emmanuel, about the redevelopment of commercial buildings. So knocking them down and rebuilding them. There's something like, I didn't count them actually, but it's heavily restricted by conditions like highways, amenity, landscaping, noise, heritage. The list is so long that it's actually a bit like applying for full planning permission.
Yeah.
How do you think how do you feel the sales? Okay, do you feel everyone's going to see this and jump in, and there's going to be this building boom where all of a sudden, rather than getting new buildings necessarily, we're getting a lot of existing buildings being rebuilt on? Is that? Do you think that's what's going to happen, or do you think it'll be a bit more slow and measured?
I think it's slow and measured.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if this adds a great deal at any pace to the housing stock, quite frankly.
Yeah.
What it does throw up is it throws up a number of interesting questions about how well the council might be able to protect certain policy objectives it's got. So let's say, for instance, it's trying to protect the loss of community uses. Well, let's throw back to the example I gave a little while ago about being able to say, well, we can go from our creche to a Tesco's. Well, at the moment, those two sit into separate use classes. You need planning permission, and if you need planning permission, the council's policy then comes into play saying, sorry, no loss of community use, you've got to stay where you are. However, after September, they sit in the same use class. So the council can't say that, because the policy only comes into play if they say there's a material change of use. But as you're in the same use class, it's assumed that there's no material change of use. And it seems absurd to say, well, actually, they've got very similar character going from a creche to a Tesco's, because they're completely different character. You know, one's clearly got a community function, the other one maybe not so much. But then again, I think we're in a different world. I mean, you look at what happened at the beginning of the lockdown. The businesses that had to stay open were like the Tesco's Expresses. They were essential grocers around the corner. And because they were regarded as essential, I think the government, I think local communities began to realise, actually, they're really important for us to just keep on going as individuals, as community, for us to live our life. So they've actually kind of taken a different meaning in policy terms, which is why I think the government's lumped them in together.
Yep.
But I think the reason they've done so is because if you've got a shop which doesn't work, it's unviable, it may actually put a lot of developers off actually buying that building, because with a lot of developers, their slice of the profit stack might actually be tied up in the retail unit, particularly if you've got other equity investors involved. Their slice of it, or the bank slice of it, tends to come out a lot of the time from the commercial value in the residential above, and then you're left over with what effectively is just the retail bit. So if you've got very, very little retail value, and the council won't let you move out from a shop because they don't want you to lose a shop, then you can now move that to an office, or you can move that to other uses, which might be more viable, and then it becomes more attractive. Then the deal is back on for you as a developer. So I think it might help to facilitate deals going forward.
Yeah, gotcha. Do you think is there any major bits in the changes that you go, whoa, I think they made a mistake there, that's going to come back and bite them, you know?
Well, I mean, particularly the one around commercial uses, I think that's going to be a difficult one for a lot of councils to swallow, because there's not an awful lot they can do about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I suggested to our client who was looking to swap over to Hall, to a nursery, and then to Tesco's, to say, don't put in your planning application to swap this to a nursery, because they will know that in a month's time we'll be able to move that over to a Tesco's Express. So they'll grant planning, but they'll put in a planning condition, say, we're going to actually withdraw the use classes order from this. So we're going to strip that freedom from you.
Yeah.
So we want to be able to make that move while they've got no control over it.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's one of the main issues around it. I think that's going to be an issue for them. The stuff under PD, which is the breaks basically into three parts, and whichever one you choose, it's not as if you've got a whole load of PDs in front of you where you can say, I can go for any combination of these together. It doesn't work like that. You've either got a purpose-built block of flats and those shops in it, or you've got mixed use, or it's terraced, or it's detached. And whichever one it is depends upon which of those PD that you're going to go for in terms of your extra stories. Or if you don't want to put extra stories on an existing block, you want to do a knockdown and rebuild, then you'll go for a different PD. So it depends what kind of building you're looking at and also how you want to deliver your new scheme as well. So that will select which one you go for. It's like a pick and choose as to which one you go for. But because they've got these conditions around them, such as impact on neighbouring amenity, outlook, sunlight, daylight, I think councils will probably be less fired up about trying to withdraw permitted development rights in some of these cases. They might kind of just take more of a wait and see approach to it because they think they've got a bit more control over what gets built afterwards.
Just judging on the stuff that you've been saying. Sorry, you go, Brett. You
go, mate.
Yeah, so just going through the various bits in terms of the PD, to actually get the highest chance of success, it looks like not only in addition to having a planning consultant, you need to do additional reports alongside it. So one is transport, maybe light or rights of light, and various reports to support the application to make it easy for the council to just give you the PD without any real issues. So there's probably more work involved maybe than a normal planning application, especially if you're doing above, a block of flats in terms of making the appearance fit in well, especially if you've got a pitch roof. So there's a few other bits and pieces that you need to take into consideration to make it a much higher chance of success. So with a normal PD scheme, with the new laws, how long would you think one of these things might take so you can actually get the green light to go ahead with it? Typical process, would you say?
Oh God, I think we'll be looking at 3 or 4 or maybe even 6 months in some cases. Okay. Because the thing is, there's no... Yeah, I mean, I think with Office to Resi, a lot of people have been thinking, well, actually, there's this cut-off date, like a long stop. The council's got up to 56 days with an Office to Resi prior approval, or retail to residential prior approval, or agricultural to residential prior approval. Council has 56 days to make a decision, and if it doesn't make a decision in those 56 days, you've automatically got it. It's really interesting that none of these PD rights have that board approval provision. So basically, the council could take longer than 8 weeks, quite a bit longer than 8 weeks, I should imagine, in some cases. Now, I know Brett's shaking his head there and sighing and thinking, "Oh my God, it's going to be, it's going to be a nightmare." Maybe. The thing is, if a council's not ready to make a decision and it's hard up against a 56-day deadline, then what do you think it's more likely to do? It's more likely to refuse. Whereas if it had maybe another month, that might add a little bit to holding costs and other costs. But wouldn't you rather wait another month if there's a prospect that by the end of that month the council will grant you permission and you don't have to start all over again? Yeah. So having that flexibility in it, I think, on the one hand, can be better. And I don't know what the experience of other planning consultants has been, but I've been dealing with these PDs ever since they first came in 2013. And in 7 years, I've only had 3 deemed prior approvals in every other single case. And you can imagine we probably dealt with hundreds over the years. Yeah. And that's a really small proportion. One of them, the council made a decision, but they got it legally wrong, so we went to the High Court and won. The other one, the council made a decision, but they made it a day too late because they calculated the time period wrong. And And I think in the other case, the council just failed to make a decision in any way. So in fact, only one of those three was a genuine failure to make any decision. The others were on a technicality.
Yeah.
So it's actually a really small proportion.
Yeah.
Not sure how much worth there is in the deemed approval provision.
Yeah.
That's
I mean, I think it's all moving in a good direction for development and that, which it needs to, especially with, you've got, like we're sort of more in the office to resi. We do a lot of, where we buy the resi sort of things. And I think that's great because a lot of resi stuff, a lot of this office stuff just isn't being used. It's sitting there vacant for ages, and and you start out getting broken windows and vandalisation and things like that, and it looks unsightly. So you come in and get some new flats there and create the community.
Yeah, I agree. And I have to say, of the PD rights, so you've got the first 6, which are about purely putting extra stories on existing buildings, whether or not they're mixed use, whether or not they're detached, whether or not they're terraced, whether or not they're purpose-built flats, or whether or not they're dwelling houses. So that's the first 6. The 7th one, I think, is particularly interesting. This is the one of redevelopment of existing commercial buildings. So they have to be in a B1 use, either as offices, R&D, or light industrial, or they have to be purpose-built blocks of flats. And there has to be in those uses since the beginning of 1990. It's actually not all that long ago. And you could knock down, put in a basement or cellar, even if there wasn't a basement there, or sort of a lower ground floor. You can go up to 2 stories above the existing height. It's capped at 18 metres, which probably is the equivalent of about, I don't know, maybe about 5-6 stories, I should imagine.
Yeah.
There's a list as long as your arm that you have to tick, which most people will look at and say, well, it looks like a normal planning application. But think about it. If you've got a B1 office building you want to knock down and redevelop, what do you normally have to do to the council? Let's say if they've got an Article 4 direction in place saying you can't convert that to residential under the existing office to resi PD, but you want to do a knockdown and rebuild and you want to put some better quality units there, you normally have to market it for a period of at least 12 to 18 months. This building is sitting there perhaps on the market. You want to take that risk, you want to buy it, but then unless it works out on an investment basis for you, there's no point in you taking the risk. You're not going to buy it because then you have to sit on it for the next 12 to 18 months before the council will even let you out of the starting blocks on the application. However, if you know that it's been vacant for at least 6 months prior to your application, then you don't have to worry about that 12 to 18 month period. That gets you out of the starting blocks. Then it's a question of the quality of the scheme after that.
Yeah.
So I think that one's quite useful, actually. But again, it's under the permitted development order. So councils who have got this philosophical fixation on not losing offices and have Article 4 directions all over the place in their boroughs, they might slap an Article 4 direction on these. But there is going to be a period where you can move pretty damn quickly on these sorts of things, because you've got to bear in mind that the Article 4 directions, normally when they come in, they're not immediate. So it's not as if this becomes law 1st of September, 2nd of September, council says you can't do it. The council will have to then apply for an Article 4 direction, go through a process with it, might take a few weeks, get it signed off by the council, and then normally there's like several months to a year's hiatus before it takes effect. They're normally not immediate. So you've got a window whereby even if there is going to be a restriction coming in that won't allow you to do this afterwards, you've got this window whereby if you act quickly enough and you've got the right opportunity sitting in front of you and you get your application in and you get consent on it quickly enough, then you can get it through.
Yeah, gotcha.
But the problem is that these consents could take several months to come through. You've got to prepare the schemes. You've got all the reports to go in. So even with a non-immediate answer for full direction, it might still be a bit tight. So you can't sit on your hands with some of these things.
Yeah, you've got to move quickly. You've got to be nimble. My fear is that people are going to start overinflating their properties again, like they did with office schemes again, to make the numbers not work. And I think COVID-19 has proven beyond doubt that you've got to have sufficient profit margins, and woe be you for not taking heed of that, not listening to agents and doing your own numbers just to make sure things really stack up. And I'd say you've got to be working for now 25% on cost, a minimum of 20% on GDV as a bare minimum after finance cost, and probably a bit more to take any movement in the marketplace. So having a really good scheme where you can make the numbers work and is really important.
Yeah. And I think that if you're prepared to go for a really good scheme that makes the numbers work and it's an attractive scheme, then you shouldn't have any fear about going for a full application for planning permission, as long as you can get over the principle of development in the first place. Because at the end of the day, when I speak to most officers, that's really all they want. They want to see a really good quality scheme come forward. And if it comes forward, they're prepared to justify in reverse how the policy is interpreted, how it works, and so on and so forth. It's a bit like, if you've got these court cases that end up in like the Court of Appeal or the House of Lords, they come up with these absurd decisions sometimes, but that's because they want to get to a particular point in that decision, and then they'll reverse it backwards. They'll think, well, how can we possibly justify where we want to end up in the first place? So, it is a bit like that. I think your point about expectations of vendors and the market going a bit crazy, maybe, or high land prices is a really good one, Emmanuel, because seeing the posts that I see on social media as I'm posting about this stuff, people getting very excited, a lot of SME developers getting very excited. It's really interesting that the ones who have probably been around in the market or been dealing with full planning schemes for a bit more, they're slightly more tempered about it. Their response is a lot more muted. And my concern is that you're going to get lots of people you're going to be going to buildings and putting in crazy bids and putting crazy numbers into the heads of the vendors or the owners. And then it's going to take some time, several months, probably until those vendors feel some real pain. Let's say if we go into a recession, it'd be really interesting what happens when the furlough scheme ends, for instance, after October. And, we don't have this wage-driven economy quite so much as we have at the moment with the government pumping money in. Yeah. And, then might have to come down quite a bit, but it'll take many, many months because, we saw that with the office to resi schemes. And so many people posting, I put in this bid on that and I put on that bid on this. And then you never hear from them again. And the reason why is because it's like one of those casinos in Las Vegas. Now, you only hear the sound of the cash machine as it pays out. But when their deal collapses because they can't get the funds, because they put in the crazy scheme which the bank won't back, and they can't get a valuation on it, so their funding collapses and they can't complete, and the thing's back on the market. But meanwhile, they've done the damage because now the agent thinks it's worth this, the vendor thinks it's worth
so does the owner and the rest of it. I get that.
Yeah. And then several months down the line, they think, okay, it might have fallen, but it's a rising market and prices only ever go up. So now we've got to the point where we thought we were in the first place 6 months later. It's just, it drives me crazy, drives me nuts.
So we've been on for about an hour now, so we're going to try and wrap up. But in summary, I think the new PD laws means, first and foremost, make sure you have a pretty good damn planning consultant by your side advising you. Take advantage of some of the schemes that are going to be available for short windows of time, maybe 6 to 12 months. Be nimble. Have the professional team around you so you can have the different reports, and go for the quick wins wherever you can. Anything else you want to add to that, Brett or David? I think that's more or less it. Jimmy's been very quiet today. He's obviously
I've I've been listening, and it's been nice to pick some tips up there, David. I'll be in contact with you as well. I've got a big site I'm working on at the moment. So yeah, I'll be in contact because I'll be using you as my planning consultant for that one, definitely. Don't want to be making any costly mistakes.
Be good to see you again, Jimmy.
Yeah,
no, I think that's a good sums up from my point of view, Manuel. Nice one.
Yeah. No, that's yeah. I'm happy.
Right.
Yeah, it's an easy man.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you again, Brett, Emmanuel, and David. I'll be in contact. And well done, Chris, for putting it all together.
Cheers, guys.
David, once again, thank you for your knowledge, your expertise, explaining it in as easy way as possible for all of us to understand. Hopefully the listeners will really enjoy it. They can contact you. Where can they contact you, David?
David at drkplanning.co.uk.
Thank you again, and thank you for listening to another Straight Property podcast. Talking podcast. Take care. Have a great weekend, guys.
Cheers, guys. See you later.
Cheers, boys. See ya. Bye.